Today I'm forging a Damascus steel knife from giant bearing rollers. This project was full of unexpected challenges, so grab some popcorn and let's get started. My brother found this massive old bearing in a scrapyard and bought it for almost nothing. Unlike a normal ball bearing, this one uses large cylindrical rollers instead of balls. That gave me an idea. I wanted to make Damascus steel from these rollers because I believed this steel would be even tougher. The first step was taking the bearing apart and removing every roller. The easiest way to do that was with an angle grinder. Once I had all the rollers out, I collected every single one. I wasn't going to use all of them, but I wanted to save the rest for future projects. Next, I fired up my charcoal forge and heated the rollers until they were glowing red. My goal was to forge several identical flat steel plates from them. I started hammering. The moment my hammer hit the hot steel, I could immediately tell just how hard these rollers were. They didn't want to flatten at all, but after a lot of effort, I finally shaped them into flat plates. Once they were forged, I moved over to the belt grinder. Every plate had to be perfectly flat before I could stack them together. After machining them, I decided not to weld the plates tightly against each other. Instead, I intentionally left a 2mm gap between every layer. Later, those gaps would be filled with another steel alloy to create a much more interesting Damascus pattern. To keep every gap exactly the same, I came up with a simple trick. I placed thin nails between the plates while welding only the ends together. After the welds cooled, I simply pulled the nails back out. Now, every gap was perfectly identical. The next step was building a steel container to hold the entire stack. Now here's where things get interesting. I filled all those gaps with steel powder mixed with a small amount of nickel powder. Then I added a little borax before sealing the container shut. Now comes my favorite part. I heated the container in the forge and forged it with nothing but my hammer until everything inside fused into one solid billet. Yes, only a hammer. No hydraulic press. I've been forging Damascus steel completely by hand for years. Once everything had bonded together, I let the billet cool. Then I cut away the outer steel container, leaving only the forged core made from the bearing rollers and the added steel alloy. The billet had fused together perfectly. Now it was time to continue forging. My goal was simple. First, draw the billet out longer. Then forge it down to about 5mm thick. After that, forge the blade tip, and finally the tang. I got back to work, but this turned out to be one of the most physically demanding parts of the entire project. From early morning until late evening, I hammered almost without stopping. I only paused for food and water. By the end of the day, I could barely feel my hands after thousands of hammer blows. But it was worth it. This was the forged blade I ended up with. Tomorrow, I'll begin refining it and turning it into the finished knife. The next morning, I started working at the belt grinder. My first job was thinning and leveling both sides of the blade. Using a 36 grit belt, I removed every hammer mark and smoothed out all the uneven surfaces left from forging. Once the sides were perfectly flat, I moved on to refining the profile. This included shaping the overall outline of the knife on the belt grinder and using a hand file in the areas the grinder couldn't reach. When the profile was finally perfect and every measurement looked right, it was time for the most important stage of knife making: grinding the bevels. Why are the bevels so important? First, they determine how well the knife performs when cutting. Second, they define the overall appearance of the blade. Clean, symmetrical bevels make a knife not only perform better, but also look far more professional. So I took my time and carefully ground both bevels until I was completely satisfied. Once that was finished, I began sanding the blade in preparation for heat treatment. I sanded every surface to 150 grit. Now it was time to harden the steel. I fired up my charcoal forge once again. Most of the time I use natural hardwood charcoal, although I sometimes use coal as well. I heated the blade to approximately 850 degrees Celsius and quickly quenched it in oil. Now the steel was extremely hard and durable. Next came another long sanding session. I continued from exactly where I had stopped, 150 grit, and worked all the way to 2000 grit. Once the sanding was complete, I thoroughly washed the blade to remove every trace of oil from the surface. Then I placed it into ferric chloride for several minutes. And here's the moment I'd been waiting for. Just to look at that pattern. The added steel powder created beautiful flowing lines throughout the Damascus steel, giving the blade exactly the look I had hoped for. Now it's finally time to start making the handle. For this knife, I wanted to make a bolster that was as simple as possible while still looking elegant. So I started with a piece of brass. I marked the dimensions, drilled the opening, carefully cleaned it up with a hand file, and then shaped the bolster on the belt grinder until it fit perfectly. Next, I made a matching brass spacer that would sit between the bolster and the handle. To add a little contrast, I included a thin orange Textilite liner. For the handle, I chose a beautiful piece of walnut. I cut it to size, drilled the tank slot, applied epoxy to every contact surface, assembled all the parts together, and left everything to cure overnight. The next day, once the epoxy had fully hardened, I moved back to the belt grinder. Following the outline I had drawn earlier, I removed all the excess wood using a 36 grit belt until the handle reached its final shape. Once I was happy with the profile, I switched to hand sanding and carefully smoothed every surface. After that, I applied a protective wood oil to keep the handle safe from moisture and to bring out the natural beauty of the walnut grain. Finally, I sharpened the blade to 4,000 grit. Now it's razor sharp, and this is the final result of the experiment. From old bearing rollers to a beautiful Damascus steel knife. If you enjoyed this project, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.